Okay, U.S. history peeps, here we go. We are still talking about the Cold War today. Our main topic of conversation is the Red Scare today. So, Red Scare is definitely a term that you should know. It is a big part of the Cold War. Red stands for the color red, which was a symbol of communism in this time. And scare just kind of stands for fear, right? So, we had this big fear of communism and everything that it stood for. And we saw communism and what we stood for as capitalists as like big components of each other. And, we've talked in previous lessons about the domino effect and our fear of it taking over the entire world and the containment policy that we followed. So this just goes right on with those same conversations. First off, I got to remind you because this is a huge part of everything we talk about Cold War. This is an ideological battle, right? And when I say ideological, I mean the idea of capitalism and how we view our free market economy and our freedoms versus communism, which was very much, led from the top down. People were told what to do, much less freedom and things like that. So these are two ideologies that are just, right in each other's face, and that's basically what the Cold War really was. And you mix in a few atomic weapons and the threat of our entire world being blown up 50 times over, and it gets really intense, right? So, did we have a reason to be fearful? That's the first question. Well, yeah, we did because a lot of times we talk about spies and we kind of joke about them and talk about moles, and we got reality television shows about it and stuff like that. But spies, as far as like spies from Russia spying on our nuclear secrets, was a very real thing in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Here's just a couple examples of the fears of communism hitting home. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, probably the most famous spies, the only spies that were sentenced to death for their crimes of espionage. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were both involved in the State Department in various degrees, and they were found inside of a much larger, probably Soviet spy ring, passing nuclear secrets from the United States, which obviously already had atomic weapons, to the Soviets, which I think tested their first atomic weapon in the late 40s, early 50s. And we were shocked with how quickly they developed that bomb, after we had used it to end World War II in Japan. And we kind of tracked down, how these nuclear secrets got passed from the United States to Russia, and a lot of it came down to these two people right here. And I don't even know if a lot of it came down to them. I think they kind of just became the fall people for this. So the Rosenbergs definitely were guilty. They definitely had espionage on their hands, and they were, tried and sentenced to execution via the electric chair, which actually was carried out in 1953. And like I said, these are the only two spies that will be convicted of espionage and sentenced to death throughout the entire Cold War. So that's why you should know their names. Another really famous case, though, was Alger Hiss. And this, once again, it takes place in the government. Like, these are communist people or people with communist ties that are in our government. And at this time, like, we really get paranoid about this stuff. And Alger Hiss in 1950 was imprisoned for perjury. I think he was sentenced to prison for like 5 years for perjury. Now, if you remember what perjury is lying under oath. And in his case, he was lying to the congressional hearing that put him under subpoena and asked him questions about whether he ever had ties to communist parties or not. Alger Hiss was not necessarily a spy. He was not convicted of any espionage. Definitely was not convicted and sentenced to death like the Rosenbergs. But he lied under oath about having any communist ties whatsoever. When we found out later on, he actually did, and there was proof that he did. And this congressional hearing was actually headed up by somebody you might recognize, Mr. Richard Nixon, who will later on become president of the United States. But in this point in history, he plays the role of the bulldog attorney, almost going after this guy for lying under oath, and sentenced him to 5 years. But once again, like, just another proven communist, person in our own government, which really kind of spooked people that this could be happening. So, and then this takes just a huge right turn, and here's where everything gets off the rails with this senator from Wisconsin. His name's Joseph McCarthy, and maybe you've heard of this guy before. Maybe you've heard of McCarthyism, but this guy really takes things to the next level, not in a good way. Okay, Joseph McCarthy at one point in 1950 kind of brazenly stood up in the middle of a congressional session, held up some papers, and he said, "I hold in my hand the name of 205 communists who are working for the State Department at this very moment." And that was like a really bold statement. And it was kind of like, almost took the air out of the room that, is he telling the truth? Does he really have the names and maybe proof to back up 205 people in our own government that are communist sympathizers or people that are, communists in our own government? Well, in fact, we know now that he did not. Most of this stuff was made up by him. But once this train got rolling, like McCarthy just boarded and he was the engineer and he freaking rode this thing all the way to the end. So, what I mean by that is he went after these people that he said had so called communist ties, right? His famous question when interviewing any of these people, like his first question was always, you know, do you now or have you ever had any association with the Communist Party? And, some of these people just stood up and said no. But other people, and this was their right under the First Amendment, freedom of speech, refused to answer that question. And they basically said that we're not the ones on trial here. You need to show us proof that you have us as some kind of communist sympathizer or something. Where's your proof? Like how are you bringing up our names yet you have no proof that we have any communist ties? And he tried to put it back on them. Well, McCarthy would have none of that because he would just basically say, well, if you're not going to admit to it, then, or denounce it, if you're not going to brazenly just say, no, I've never been a communist and I never have been, never will be, then we must just assume that you are, almost like a guilty until proven innocent, which does not go with the American way of doing things. So Joseph McCarthy was kind of the main face of this. But there was an entire committee. It's on this slide here, HUAC, H-U-A-C. It was called the Committee for House of Un-American Activities Committee. And it was a committee put together to basically seek out people in our government and people who were influential in society, like people in Hollywood, that might have communist ties. So they pulled in tons of people from Hollywood because there was this belief that, like, people in Hollywood could get you to believe anything by making a movie about something. I mean, you guys have seen this just in your own lifetime through Netflix, right? Like nobody pays attention to, big cats until Tiger King comes out and then everybody's talking about it, right? So Hollywood and documentaries and that kind of stuff have immense power. And, the Congress knew this. Joseph McCarthy knew this, and he basically went after these people. And let's be honest, most of these people came in and just stood up in front of Congress and said, no, I have no communist ties whatsoever, and I've never had any communist ties. Well, then McCarthy would bring up like groups or organizations that they had been a part of, and it could be proven that they were a part of that organization. And then McCarthy would say, well, they have communist ties within that committee or that organization. And most of these people were like taken by complete surprise. They had no idea they had communist ties tied to that committee or organization they were a part of. So it just turned into this huge, witch hunt is basically what it was. There was these very famous 10 people called the Hollywood 10, and these 10 people would not answer any questions and basically put the onus on McCarthy saying, hey, if you're saying that we're communists, we want to see your proof. And obviously McCarthy didn't have any proof. So what he would do is he would try to create plea deals with these people. And here's how this gets really ugly. He would bring these people in private session and say, hey, if you can give me the names of people that you know to be communist sympathizers, then we'll cut you loose, right? Like we'll get off of your trail and we'll get onto somebody else's trail. So they kind of put him in this position of like, do you want to rat out 2 or 3 of your friends? Or do you want to take the fall for this and us come, full bore after you? And it was just complete ugliness, right? And within these trials, a couple of people that you guys are going to recognize actually stand up and speak in these trials that Joseph McCarthy and the HUAC committee called. And that's Walt Disney, for one. Walt Disney's testimony is, I mean, it's funny now, but back then it was not at all. But he was basically asked, did you ever sell any Disney products to Russians or communists? And at one point, I think Walt Disney said, yes, at one point we sold the story of the 3 little pigs to, Russia. And you're like, how does that prove that Walt Disney is a communist? It doesn't, but just the fact that he had sold a Disney product to the communists made a lot of people think that he was a communist sympathizer, right? And then another, like a B-list, maybe even a C-list actor at this point, was called up to testify. His name was Ronald Reagan, and he was kind of a Western, like I say, B-list Hollywood star. But who knew later on he'll become president of the United States and actually be a main figure that brings the Cold War to an end. So just kind of a crazy full circle there. I'm going to post in our video page today a short little audio from Joseph McCarthy responding to Edward R. Murrow, who was a CBS host at that point, like a news host. And Edward R. Murrow went hard after McCarthy, saying he was being irresponsible and that he was basically, being reckless with his accusations. And McCarthy does what? I'm sure you can guess. He says that Edward R. Murrow is a communist, right? And this just firestorm just carries after. Finally, McCarthy gets just completely out of bounds and starts saying that people in the Army, our own U.S. Army, are involved in communism. And at that point, people start to lose faith in McCarthy and start to see him for what he is, which is a coward liar. Okay. But yeah, McCarthy and the Red Scare and McCarthyism has a huge impact in the 1950s. I will go as far as to say this McCarthyism and this Red Scare and, making people fear anything other than one set of beliefs really kind of restricts our entire political spectrum, right? You could not be very far right or very far left. And you guys know that nowadays the political spectrum is very shrunk, right? Like there is no middle ground. You are either on one side or the other. And if you're on one side, you hate the other side. And I would say Joseph McCarthy, maybe more than any other one person, is probably responsible for our society getting to that point when it comes to politics. So Joseph McCarthy obviously will go down as a bad guy in history, making false accusation based on rumor and guilt, and he basically goes down with the ship. He gets to the point where Congress censors him, or censure, right? And basically, will not listen to anything that he says because all he does is spout lies. So, wanted to kind of finish this out with a few things here, that kind of go with the Cold War. McCarthyism, I mentioned. You will see McCarthy represented in a ton of political cartoons. I've showed you a couple already. And his claim obviously was never proven. Those 205 names he had were probably made up. He might not even had names, knowing him. And McCarthy's popularity lessened and lessened as people found out, he really had no proof behind what he was accusing people of. So here's a few other things that I think are really important to understand about this time in our Cold War past, right? During the Cold War, you're talking 1950s specifically, we're under constant threat that at any time there could be a nuclear war that starts with us and Russia. So in schools, like students were taught these duck and cover drills. Basically, like if they're, the same way that we would practice a fire drill or an earthquake drill, natural disaster, we would practice nuclear fallout drills. And basically what you did was you kind of duck and cover. You get under the desk and, like this was going to help if you were like the epicenter of a nuclear attack. Obviously, it's not going to. But we would practice these drills in schools, and schools took them very seriously because it was seen as a real possibility. Couple more pictures here of elementary school students practicing those duck and cover drills. I mean, ask your parents about this, maybe even grandparents, probably grandparents. Ask your grandparents about this and ask them if they remember anything like this, going through this in school. Or maybe some aunts and uncles that were in, grade school or secondary school through the 1950s. Here's some other drills out in the hallway, duck and cover drills. This is just hilarious right here. Like we actually had this whole propaganda campaign with Bert the Turtle, hiding in his shell. Anytime danger comes, you got to cover, just like Bert the Turtle does. He's smart. He's got shelter on his back. You got to find shelter, whether it's your desk or out in the hallways or whatever. So, this is how far we were taking it. We were actually having this, these educational films shown to students. I mean, just look how ridiculous this is. Think about a high school. Think about you guys watching this kind of stuff, as a drill in school. So that's it for today. Thank you guys for hanging with me through this. And next time we are going to try to do a Zoom meeting. Now there's been a little bit of concern about Zoom meetings being like secure and stuff. So I'm still getting some guidance on how we're going to do that Zoom meeting. But next week we are going to do a Zoom together. You can either attend in person while that Zoom meeting is going on, and I'll send out an invitation and a time for that. Or you can watch it afterwards if you can't join us at that specific time. So until next time, guys, take it easy.